Lübbecke, Lower Saxony, West Germany, September 1962. 17 years. That was how long it had been since Frau Elisabeth Weber last saw British soldiers in her village square. Back then, they had arrived as conquerors, sweeping through Germany in the chaotic spring of 1945. The war had just ended, the Reich lay in ruins, and 3 women in Lübbecke were widows before they turned 30. Now, on a crisp autumn morning, Elizabeth stood at her kitchen window, flour dusting her hands from baking. She watched a car with British number plates turn onto the cobblestone street. Her breath caught. For a moment she was 42 again, standing in the ruins, watching foreign soldiers requisition what little her village had left. Behind her, Margaret Hoffman set down her coffee cup with a trembling hand. "They actually came," she whispered. "Mein Gott, Elizabeth, they actually came back." The letter had arrived 6 weeks earlier, typed in careful English on British Army Veterans Association letterhead. It had taken Elizabeth 3 attempts to read it through without stopping. Even now she could recite it from memory. "We never forgot your kindness during a difficult time. If you'll permit us, we'd like to return, not as occupiers, but as friends." The car door opened. A man stepped out, older now, grey at the temples, but still recognizably the same lanky corporal billeted in her destroyed home for 8 months in 1945. He'd been 23 then, barely older than her husband had been when he marched off to the Eastern Front. Elizabeth wiped her hands on her apron and felt the small wooden cross at her neck. Her husband had carved it in 1939 before the world went mad. She took a breath and did something unthinkable 17 years earlier. She opened her door and walked out to meet them. To understand that moment, you must rewind to May 1945. The shooting had stopped, but the suffering had not. Germany was a wasteland. Allied bombing had destroyed nearly 80% of its infrastructure. Cities were graveyards of rubble. Transportation collapsed. Agriculture stood still. And everywhere, in every village and town, there were widows. Over 1 million German war widows existed in what would become West Germany alone. Women like Elisabeth Weber, notified of her husband's death at Stalingrad in February 1943. Women like Margaret Hoffman, whose husband died retreating from France. Women like Anna, who lost hers in the final senseless days when everyone already knew the war was lost. They were the faces of defeat, black-clad, hollow-eyed, responsible for children and parents in a country that could barely feed itself. The pensions barely bought bread. Most widows worked wherever they could, carrying the double burden of labor and childcare, mother and father in households where the father would never return. Into this devastation came the British Army of the Rhine, 800,000 Commonwealth soldiers tasked with occupying northwestern Germany under strict orders. No fraternization with civilians. You must not walk with them, shake hands, visit homes or make gifts, Field Marshal Montgomery instructed. It was a policy designed to fail. Soldiers resisted. Many worked directly with civilians. Others felt pity. Some, like Corporal Thomas Hartley of the Yorkshire Regiment, were billeted in German homes and discovered compassion required less energy than hatred. Hartley arrived in Lübbecke in June 1945 and was sent to the Weber house, or what remained of it. The upper floor was destroyed. The ground floor barely stood. Elizabeth answered the door with a child on her hip, fear plain in her eyes. She spoke no English, he spoke no German. The requisition form needed no translation. That first night passed in silence. Elizabeth gave him the only intact bedroom and served turnip soup and black bread, her movements stiff with fear and resentment. Days became weeks. Small courtesies accumulated. Hartley repaired the roof. He brought medicine when her son fell ill. He filled water containers during his morning routine. They weren't grand gestures. They were the small kindnesses of survival. In a stripped world, they mattered enormously. 3 months in, Hartley found Elizabeth crying at the table with a letter. She pointed to a photograph, then made a cutting gesture at her throat. "Stalingrad," she said. Hartley had fought in Normandy and lost friends, but looking at this grieving widow, he couldn't summon hatred. He made tea and sat with her while she cried. After that, something shifted. Not friendship, but recognition. She taught him German. He taught her son English. On Sundays, he lit the stove while they went to church. Other widows noticed. Margaret Hoffman housed a British sergeant. Anna Richter received help repairing her staircase. These weren't romances. They were alliances forged in ruin. By late 1945, the non-fraternization policy quietly collapsed. By 1946, marriage bans were lifted. But most bonds were never romantic, only human. Hartley transferred in early 1946. He shook Elizabeth's hand, thanked her, and left. She assumed she'd never see him again. 16 years passed. Hartley returned to Yorkshire, married, had children. But he never forgot the widow who shared her soup and taught him humanity. In 1961, veterans proposed returning, not as soldiers, but as civilians, to thank the women who had helped them survive that strange time between war and peace. In September 1962, 3 British men drove to Lübeck. Elizabeth watched them approach, time collapsing as past and present merged. "You came back," she finally said, and in that moment decades of suffering were acknowledged, not erased, but seen. Margaret appeared behind Elizabeth, stunned. From down the street, Anna hurried toward them, her hand over her mouth. Hartley spoke carefully in German. "We wanted to thank you, to see how you are." For a moment, Elizabeth couldn't speak. Then English failed her and she returned to German. "After everything, after we were enemies, you came back to see us." "You were never our enemies," Hartley replied quietly. "Not here. You were people trying to survive like us. And you were kind when you didn't have to be." Anna reached them, breathless. She looked at the British private, now grey-haired. "I thought you'd forgotten us," she said, starting twice before finishing. "How could we forget?" the sergeant answered. "You shared your homes when you had nothing. You showed us decency, we remembered." They stayed 3 days in Lübeck, lodging at the rebuilt guest house. Days were spent drinking coffee, sharing memories, meeting children now grown. Elizabeth's son returned from Hanover to meet the soldier who'd brought him medicine as a child. The men brought tea and chocolate, but more importantly, recognition. They bore witness. They affirmed that the kindness of 1945 had not been forgotten, dismissed, or reduced to convenience. On the final evening, Elizabeth hosted dinner, potato soup or dark bread, a small roast she barely afforded. Margaret brought cake, Anna brought apples. Former enemies sat at the same table, speaking not of war but of rebuilding, children, and the slow work of peace. Hartley gave Elizabeth a photograph from 1945. Him, impossibly young, standing before her ruined house. On the back he'd written, "To Frau Weber, with gratitude." Elizabeth cried not from grief but relief. For 17 years she'd wondered if those months had meant anything at all. Now she knew they had remembered, and they had returned to say so. The reunion rippled outward. Elizabeth kept the photo for life. Margaret began corresponding with the sergeant. Anna's story reached newspapers as proof reconciliation was possible. The men returned again in 1969 with wives and children. Conversation flowed easily now. The shared past bound them in unexpected ways. The legacy of Lübeck isn't found in policy or treaties. It exists in kitchens, gardens, letters, and memories of mercy extended when it wasn't required. History remembers occupation in broad strokes, but beneath it were countless small choices, kindness or cruelty, mercy or contempt. Most vanished with time, Lübeck did not. 3 men chose to acknowledge what had mattered. 3 women chose to receive them. What we needed, Elizabeth later said, was to know we were seen. Years later, a small village museum displayed a photograph. 3 British men, 3 German women, smiling together in 1962. The caption read simply, "When former enemies became friends." Elizabeth died in 1983. At her funeral, her son spoke of rubble, resilience, and a British corporal who returned to say thank you. Thomas Hartley died in 1997. Among his belongings was a wooden cross and a note. Given by Frau Elisabeth Weber, Lübeck, 1962. "Even enemies are people," the note read. "Every soldier leaves someone behind." The story passed down through generations. A reminder that humanity survives devastation, and that being remembered can heal wounds war could not. "You came back," Elizabeth had said in wonder. And in coming back, they proved peace is built not only by nations but by people. Small mercies extended across old battle lines. Remembered. The soldiers who lived in Elizabeth's home after the war could have made her life unbearable. They had power, authority, and every reason to remain distant. Instead, through small acts, they made survival possible in a year designed to break people. And by returning years later, they told her something she had never been sure of. That her suffering had not been invisible, that the months of shared hardship had not been forgotten or dismissed as meaningless occupation routine, that she herself had mattered, not as a defeated German, not as a statistic, but as a woman who endured, who helped when she had almost nothing left to give, and who had been remembered for it.